Welcome to Strip Cover Lit. I'm Dalton Gentry, and I am here today for something Adrian usually handles, but we're going to be kind of going back and forth. Something a little different, but we're going to call it a poetry discussion. I think that might be the best phrase for this. And the title of this poetry discussion is Where Did Your Sidewalk End? And what I am talking about today is something that I don't think we have ever tackled on BookTube. I know we haven't. And something that I don't think a lot of people take the time to appreciate and to talk about. And that is the unusual realm of children's poetry. Now, when I was younger, the big popular book that you'd go to the library, so like in elementary school, I remember we went to the elementary school library every single week. You could take home a number of books, read them, whatever. It's a library. You know how it works. But one of the big popular books that everyone would always clamor to get was this huge white copy of Shel Silverstein's Where the Sidewalk Ends. Shel Silverstein, also the poet who wrote, well, what's the other books here? I should have prepped this a little bit better. A Light in the Attic. And a poet that a lot of people encountered as children. Now, the man Shel Silverstein himself, actually a bit of a legend, doesn't get the credit I believe he deserves. If you're familiar with the band Dr. Hook, which is a bit of an offshoot, but I really enjoy, Shel Silverstein actually wrote a lot of their songs. And if you're familiar with Johnny Cash, A Boy Named Sue, Shel Silverstein. That's the man who wrote that song there. I believe he actually won an award, maybe a Grammy, something like that, for the writing of A Boy Named Sue. But anyway, Shel Silverstein's true passion in life was poetry and art. So he would compile books of children's poetry. He would also provide all the original art for the book. So every single poem had its own art that kind of went with it. It kind of tied everything together. And this is something we experienced quite a bit when we were kids. It was completely normal to say, hey, you know, I'm reading this book of poetry. But now, unless you've really kind of specialized yourself into the field of literature, or you're really just into poetry, it seems very unusual just to go up to somebody off, the street and say, hey, what's the last book of poetry you read? Book of poems, whatever you want to call it. And that's kind of an unfortunate thing. For some reason, poetry has kind of trickled off the literary market, and it seems to be a little bizarre now. It's something that, most people don't tackle, most people don't read, most people don't write poetry, and that's a damn shame. Which kind of is what prompted the idea of this video discussion, this poetry discussion, is what happened to poetry. Because poetry is such an impactful thing in pretty much everyone's life, especially as they're growing up. I mean, we all have had Dr. Seuss read to us. If we have not had Dr. Seuss, just children's nursery rhymes are very poetic. There's a very simple rhyme pattern, usually A-B pattern. And it's something that really connects well with children. They can identify with it better. And maybe that's because they're developing the language as they're also reading this for the first time or having it read to them for the first time. So the simple choices of words, the rhyming patterns, they tend to flow. They sound nice, you can enjoy them, and you're learning about the language as you're reading the poetry for the first time. But at some point, it seems that pretty much everyone anymore, they read, their Shel Silverstein poem, and that's it. Poetry's done for them. Unless they're assigned something in school, a red rose, they never read poetry again. And there seems to be a problem here. And poetry has attempted to make a bit of a resurgence. I would say about 2014, so 15 years ago, Ellen Hopkins started slinging out the Crank series. Crank, Impulse, Glass, just a couple that I remember off the top of my head. And although novels in structure, they've very much had a very poetic tone to them. I think you could argue more than anything they were books of poetry. But not a lot of people will take the time anymore to sit down and read poetry. It's usually considered childish because it has that rhyme pattern. It's usually considered not masculine. It's very difficult to find a man who sits down and say, hey, I read a lot of poetry. For some reason, a lot of men, and maybe this is a Midwestern thing, have billed poetry as not masculine, and therefore they just shy away from it completely. And that's a damn shame. You're missing out on a lot of things there. But for some reason, we have this disconnect, and we have these stereotypical notions of what poetry is that have basically plagued us at this point. poetry can be damn near anything, and that's why we're big fans of Bukowski on the channel. Bukowski does not pull any punches. A lot of his poetry is not going to be stereotypical cheesy rhyme patterns. You're not going to find a lot of cute, fun, humorous language. A lot of his poetry hurts, and it really tackles some deep subjects. And I don't think people know that exists. Because, you know, again, when you talk to somebody about poetry, well, Dr. Seuss, that's what I got. It's what I knew when I was a kid, but I never really developed beyond that. So I don't know where I want to go with this poetry discussion today. Maybe a bit of a call to arms over anything else, saying, hey, you know, we really need to bring poetry back into the forefront of the literary world, because there's so much that you miss out on if you don't have that style of writing. And there's always an excuse, you know, I don't want to read poetry because this, I don't want to read poetry because that. I think it's all about finding the poet that is right for you. We argue about this all the time on the show. I am not really a fan of Emily Dickinson, never have been. Her poetry just doesn't click with me. But on the other hand, Adrian, that's his absolute favorite. And that's great. If it works for you, it works for you. You just have to find that poet that you can identify with, that poet that you can find, that voice that really just clicks with you. I also really like Billy Collins. Adrian absolutely hates him, and I will give you know, credit where is due. Billy Collins a little more whimsical than most. You might get some rhyming patterns here and there, but I like the man's poetry. I think he does well. He was the poet laureate for many years for the United States, I believe. But again, at one point in time, we all were budding poets. We were all reading poetry. I would guarantee if you were a writer, or you want to be a writer, or you identified as a writer at some point in your life, you probably dabbled in a little bit of poetry. But unless you fit those categories, poetry it seems it's just been completely shunned. It's just not a thing in today's reader's world. So we will make this a bit of a call to arms, and I believe we should give credit to the poets who brought us here, the Dr. Seuss's of the world, the Shel Silversteins, the Ellen Hopkins, because although they were super impactful in our lives, especially when we were young as children, the poets that you first were introduced to, the first poems that you were introduced to, the nursery rhymes, that's what got you to where you are today. That's what sparks that excitement about literature in someone, is those first few simple things that you encounter. So my question to you is, who was the poet that really struck you? And hopefully we can go all the way back to maybe when you were a child, perhaps you were reading Shel Silverstein. What made that poem special for you? And where did that leave you? Did you have no transitional period where, you know, we were in Shel Silverstein and we just kept moving forward? Poetry had always been with you. Or, like me, did you have this time with children's poetry like Shel Silverstein? And did you move away from it? Did your sidewalk end at one point in time before you found poetry again? I think it's a very interesting subject. And I do, again, think that children's poets do not get the credit that they deserve. Because not only are they slinging fun, humorous poetry that is simple for anyone to tackle. I mean, it's geared towards children, so honestly, anyone can sit down and read it and understand what is going on and find maybe a little chuckle in it. I think that's something that's really impressive and very difficult to do, and is a bit of a lost art. I don't think we've had someone in many years, and granted, I don't have children, so I haven't been reading a ton of children's poetry recently, but any time that I do read to my nieces or anything, or, you know, consider reading to my nieces, it's Shel Silverstein. That's the man. So, credit where credit is due. Thank you, Shel, for, you know, bringing me into this world of writing, into this world of poetry. And I don't know where else I want to go with this, so I'm probably just going to end, and I appreciate you staying on board with my ramblings here. But please let me know in the comments down below where poetry had its place in your life. If you're still making an effort to read more poetry, if you've honestly not experienced a lot of poetry for the first time, be honest. Let's try to make this a thing where we can get more poetry back into the hands of readers. I know here on Strip Cover Lit, we're going to be doing a lot of poetry discussions. We try to do a poetry reading every Friday, which is by far our least popular segment, but it's something we enjoy. We think it brings a nice touch to the channel. It's something a little different, and hopefully it's exposing people to more poetry, oftentimes poetry they've forgotten, oftentimes poetry maybe they've never even heard. So, if you like this kind of thing, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. Give this video a like as well. We're going to be starting to do a few more random discussions on poetry, random discussions on just the idea of literature, a little bit of the philosophy behind literature itself. And if you want to help us create more great content like this here on Strip Cover Lit, there's a link, as always, to our Patreon to be found in the description below.